or wherever. It doesn't, you don't have to give a scenario, but that might be helpful in terms of context.
Thank you. Well, you know, social scientists state that listening is our least developed skill. And as a former audiologist, I will focus my 3 suggestions on listening. There are 3 different levels at which one can listen. And the first one, listen without interrupting. Don't interrupt the speaker with questions and comments. And this action actually conveys that you are respectful and are paying attention, also called active listening, what some in the communication circles refer to. 2, listen to understand and not to respond. Often we concentrate on formulating our answer to reply to what is being said. And this in itself communicates the notion that you are self-centered and interested in what you have to say and what you think, and not on the speaker. And then finally, you want to listen for what you have in common. Many times we look at differences, and that can delay a successful start to a meaningful conversation. So build on what you have in common. And then I want to end with an adage that my grandmother used to tell me. She would say, if we were meant to talk more than we hear, we'd have 2 mouths and only 1 ear.
I like that adage. I'm struck by your comment about generous listening and listening without interrupting, as I want to do sometimes. But just in terms of, if any of you watched the recent presidential debates, there was not a lot of good listening. I'm just going to point that out, you know, apolitically, regardless of whose side you're on or not on, but there was not generous listening, it seemed, going on there. People were ready to launch into each other with a response. Professor Meg Meyers Morgan, what about you? Some suggestions for keeping difficult conversations constructive. And I know in public administration, you sometimes tackle thorny topics.
We only tackle thorny topics. I was thinking in preparation for this panel, just how many difficult conversations we can have in the classroom, and was wondering what the difference was between the classroom and just out in the world or with your family. And I do think that a strong facilitator or a strong moderator, as we've seen with the panels, is somewhat key. And so it is a little tricky navigating this with, you know, a coworker just in the hall or with your family. The 3 things I would say, the first is to stay curious. Our brain can only operate in 2 modes, and that's curious brain and judger brain. And all of us are usually locked in that judger brain. So we already have the opinion ready. We already have the response ready, as Dr. Lloyd-Jones was saying. And we're attaching judgment and meaning. And when we actually flip and we're curious, we learn a lot more. And the best example I have of that is when I tell my children what my dream was the night before. They're so curious. They don't say, oh yeah, I had a dream too, or oh yeah, that's weird. I woke up this morning, I was telling my youngest that I had a dream that I'd cut all of my friend's hair off. And she said, oh, what color was the hair? It was like this place of curiosity. There was no attachment to it. There was no making meaning. But it's such a beautiful reminder of how curiosity is just not something that we possess very much of, and to practice that. The second thing I would say is we ask pretty terrible questions. We mostly ask close-ended questions, and we're already in this world of the 2-party system, and you either like this or you don't, or you're voting for Trump or Biden. And so when you start asking close-ended questions, you're sort of bifurcating that yes or no again. Always ask open-ended questions, but more than that, don't ask questions that start with why. Why do you think that way? Why does that feel that way? Why are you saying that? That's, again, very judgy, and you feel defensive as the person answering. And so always leave questions open-ended with who and when and how. Where did you hear that? Who told you that? How did you arrive at that opinion? And that just makes it a little bit more objective and a little bit less judgy. And then the other thing I'd say, regardless of the context, because this could be anything, it could be political or otherwise, my third thing would just be make sure that you're on the same page about the discussion. So if you're going into a conversation, you might just say, what do you hope to get out of this discussion? Because one person might say, oh, I hope to change your mind. And the other person might say, I just want you to understand where I'm coming from. And so if you're working off two different agendas, you're not going to have a very productive conversation. But if you can at least agree on what the point of the conversation is, it's more likely to be constructive.
Thank you. I loved hearing about the natural curiosity of the child, and how, hopefully we can aspire to maintain our curiosity, and how it's just beautiful how she asked, what color was the hair, as opposed to, why? What does this mean, Mom? Or what's the psychological significance of you cutting off all your friend's hair? Which is pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll come back to that and hear more about that.
We need to, probably.
Professor Randle, having been out on the stump for many occasions, what are your top three suggestions for keeping? I mean, I can imagine a scenario where perhaps when you were in office, times were less polarized as they are now. I don't know that, but where people may not have come up to you and gotten in your face and said, "Hey, I disagree with you on this or that," but maybe they did, or So what tricks have you learned, or what three suggestions can you offer us?
Well, in Tulsa, Oklahoma generally, we're pretty civilized people. So the number of face-to-face irate conversations that I ever encountered was really pretty tiny. You always imagined that was just around the corner. I remember going door to door once in a campaign in the state Senate. Lady comes to the door and I say, "I'm Rodger Randle." She said, paused. It says, "My husband's been waiting for you." And so she went to get her husband, but it turned out, he wasn't anything confrontational. So we tend to do very nicely when we're face to face, because we're people who are trained to be agreeable and nice people. I think there's much more confrontation that happens today than what we experienced back in my day. And so I feel a lot more for people who are out there in the modern world. But to me, the key is when we have discussions, try to keep them from being personal, because we tend to be personal. We tend to be very judgmental. And so if we try to move off to issues and the facts on which opinions are based, then we're talking about things that aren't challenging you as a person. We're talking about facts. Where did you get that fact? That's interesting. Have you also considered these facts? And so forth. And as a general approach to dealing with problems in life that we encounter, we tend to naturally focus on the problem rather than the origin of the problem and the solution of the problem. We want to say, we got to paint that wall a different color, without ever having a discussion of, what's the matter with the color we've got now? Why do we need another color? So, my experience is the best thing, move it off of personalities, move it off of being judgmental about people, and simply talk about facts, why we feel this way, respecting the opinion of the other person, but it's fair to ask, now, where is that information coming from? What are the facts on which you have based that?
Avoid letting it get personal. That sounds very wise, very wise. All right, I'm going to ask another question of each of you, and then we'll go to some more specifics. And I think we are getting some good questions from our audience as well. And this time, Dr. Lloyd-Jones, I'll start with you. I think I did last time as well. But let's say, in this case, we're looking for your best piece of advice with a loved one if there's a point of disagreement, especially when it comes to politics. In this scenario, you can imagine the proverbial Thanksgiving table with the elder and the youthful relatives, perhaps grandchildren or nieces or nephews or cousins who don't see each other all that often, but come together. And of course, this year is totally different in that a lot of folks are not even having big family get-togethers for Thanksgiving because of the pandemic. But let's imagine that scenario. And what would you advise for communicating with loved ones with whom you may have a disagreement?
if you don't mind, someone is going to help me with my mic, and so I hear them at the door. So if we can go to the next person, and I'll be back.
Okay. Yeah. So, Professor Meg Meyers Morgan, let's toss that one to you, and that was going to be one of your specifics anyway about the family get together. So go right ahead.
So the best piece of advice that I heard before we had children was it will magnify what's already happening in your marriage. And what I've noticed with the pandemic is it's magnifying gaps or strengths in leadership, both at organizations and the nation. And I think talking about politics with your family magnifies dynamics that are already there. So I think if you're able to kind of put those on a shelf and watch them objectively, right? You're staying curious, you're seeing this pattern, you know, your aunt says this and you get stressed and, you know, hives. And if you can watch that pattern, you might actually be able to learn some very informative insights about your family and yourself in relation to them. But the biggest piece of advice that I have is no family member is worth your mental health. And no one's going to protect your mental health except for you, and you're the only guardian of that. And so you don't have to sacrifice that to eat a meal together. There are certainly a number of topics that you can talk about. I do think that if we can't get out of it, we have to get into it, right? And so if you can't get out of the conversation and you want to steer in, that's great. But again, at the end of the day, I think if you don't protect your mental health, it's going to cost too much. I just wouldn't participate in it.
Thank you. Professor Randle, do you want to tackle that one, or I can ask you something different? You're muted, sir.
I'll add a couple of points on it because
go for it.
I had an interesting experience on this very topic recently. My wife and I were on a phone call with a niece who lives in Texas. The niece is very beloved and she's a smart and intelligent person. And we were just shocked to learn that she is supporting the wrong candidate for president. And it came as a great surprise. But because there was a basis existing of respect and confidence in the person, then we just proceeded to have a nice chat that was very civilized about why she felt that way. We didn't think her answers were good, but we accepted to hear them, and we provided ours. You know, I think of other people in the family, just don't bring it up. You know, there's going to be no good solution that comes from the conversation. So I think in some cases, just accept the fact that a constructive conversation probably isn't going to happen here.
I'm interested if your niece's candidate she supported, the difference, was it that all of her kind of externalities or behavior led you to believe she was going to be voting one way, and she shocked you with sort of belying her sort of how she acts and exists? Or was it just the mere fact that she's voting differently than you? Was that the shock?
No, it wasn't a shock that she was voting differently. It was a shock that I attribute to her certain qualities which would lead her to support a certain candidate. And then I was surprised that they hadn't led her to that. You know, other people in the family, you know, I know kind of where they stand. And so everybody talks freely in those circumstances.
That is interesting. Dr. Lloyd-Jones, it sounds like you might have gotten the microphone fixed.
Does it sound better now?
Oh, it sounds like a dream.
Much better, much better.
Oh, I'm so very pleased. Thank you for bearing with me.
So yes, we're talking about your best piece of advice in communicating with loved ones about points of disagreement, especially about politics. So in the scenario where it is perhaps a conflict or disagreement with a loved one specifically.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's very important to understand why it's difficult sometimes or often to talk about politics and even other issues, religion. And if we understand why, we may not, as Professor Randle was mentioning, take it so very personally. And so research on moral conviction suggests that if someone considers that their position on an issue is really a question of right or wrong, they are less likely to want to interact with the person who disagrees on that issue. So, in other words, when it's a matter of right or wrong based on strong moral conviction, people become less tolerant of those who have opposing views. And so, consequently, if we're talking with our family members and we learn that they don't agree on a particular view, or they are supporting a candidate that we vehemently oppose, then it becomes alarming. And consequently, we find ourselves distancing. The research shows that we will even distance ourselves by moving away from them. For example, they looked at chair locations. Once individuals learn that others oppose them, they found themselves sitting across from them as opposed to next to them. And so this kind of moral conviction goes deep. Now, it doesn't happen all the time with all issues. For example, we certainly consider our football teams or our basketball teams the number one, and we will banter back and forth why they are better, and even engage in dialogue about particular players. That doesn't cause us to lose friendship, or that doesn't cause us to not call one another for an entire year. And so the moral conviction is the piece that seems to be the determining factor in terms of how we react to others who hold opposing whose views differ from our own. And so I think finding a way to talk about um, how can we talk about it? Sometimes we just have to avoid it because there's no happy medium. Other times there may be an opportunity to engage in genuine, sincere conversation, being deliberate to say, I'll speak for 1 minute without you interrupting, and then I'll let you speak for another minute without interrupting. And then perhaps we can begin to learn more about each other and why we believe or why we think the way we do.
Thank you. I see a potential marketing opportunity here for the family mute button, right? I'm going to give you 1 minute, just like that last debate. Or as we've all learned from Zoom, you're mute, you're on mute, you're on mute.
I do think there's something there in what Dr. Lloyd-Jones is saying about, almost like a sense of belonging, and your family is your first sense of belonging. And so when you disagree with your family, that can mess with your identity. Like these are the people I belong to, and now they don't agree with me. And what does that say about me? And so that does kind of because you were saying to get at the why, and that may be part of it, is just, we aren't our families, we are ourselves. And I think that's hard realization. We can belong and disagree, we can love and disagree, but it is hard to feel like more, I think more with family than anyone else, is this is where I'm supposed to belong and I don't. And that can be heavy.
I think you're to your point, Meg. There are generational differences too, and that's why we see it around the holidays when families tend to get together, and so we have various generations, pioneer generations, then the Boomers, the Gen X's, the Gen Ys, Gen Zs, etc., and with each generation, there may be a different idea of what is prominent or what is important, how we look at particular political frameworks, and consequently can bring about some hostility or people can be uncomfortable. And so talking about this and unpacking it is certainly an opportunity to better understand one another.
And remember, if I can throw this in, remember when we get together with the family, we don't have to bring up topics that are going to divide us. We can talk about grandma's pecan pie and how great it was. Sometimes that may be a more constructive conversation than the current political campaign.
Professor Randle, I'm going to start with you on this one. You're all academics, and so you all read scholarly material, but I wanted to ask you, Professor Randle, what are some reputable sources or resources that we can use to educate ourselves about the issues and about the candidates? Because certainly we are bombarded with advertising, whether it's in social media, print media, as I alluded to, television, although less so with the presidential race in Oklahoma. We're not a swing state. Advertising is highly suspect in terms of getting your information because it's very skewed. So what, I'm thinking League of Women Voters or nonpartisan types of information sources. What do you like to either use yourself, or when you were a candidate, what did you respect, or what do you recommend to your students? Or friends,
it used to be, I'm glad you brought up the League of Women Voters, because it used to be that the League of Women Voters did a wonderful voter information little newspaper that was provided. I don't think they do anything like it anymore. And it was they had questions, candidates answered them or didn't answer them, or evaded the questions, but it was a way in which you could really get some upfront information. The unfortunate truth is that it's hard to get information about these candidates. Even if you subscribe to the local newspaper in Tulsa or Norman or Oklahoma City, you're not going to get much coverage about legislative candidates, really not even too much about the big ones. TV doesn't devote too much time to it. So it really requires effort to be informed. And we have to be careful that we don't get lured into simplistic and often wrong information. So it requires an affirmative effort on our part to look for information. Now, we can find that sometimes on the candidates' websites. The candidates' websites are going to be general. They're not going to want to offend us. But if we look carefully, we can read between the lines sometimes and get the information we need to evaluate a candidate. The best way is to actually go to political events. Obviously, it's not happening in the same way today, but there are still opportunities through Zoom and virtual events to go. But if you go to political events, you can see the candidates. You can see whether they are somebody who seems sincere about what they say. Back in the summertime, we participated in an event with candidates for the city council. And I was surprised how much information I got about people, about my feeling toward the candidates, about the philosophic underpinnings of the candidates from really pretty short presentations in a Zoom event. It was tremendously informative. And those opportunities still exist. Certainly the newspapers and those kind of things, the thing we have to be cautious of is what's put out on social media. Sometimes it's not accurate. Sometimes it's meant to be pretty nasty. And that kind of thing is not helpful to us as we work to be an informed voter.
Thank you. There was a note in the chat from Josh Davis, our Executive Director of Student Affairs, who said they have League of Women Voters guides in the Student Center right now. Printed League of Women Voters guides are available. So should you want one and be on campus, you can pick one up there. Dr. Meyers Morgan.
Let me just interrupt.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Those are super valuable. I'm glad to hear. I think there was a time when they weren't doing it, but I really encourage everybody to find one. If they've got it printed, they're bound to have it online too. So those are unbiased, unedited sources of real information. You still have to evaluate what you read, but it's still great information.
And your reminder to donate to the League of Women Voters so we can maintain that.
Dr. Meyers Morgan, I'm also another note that our libraries, our Tulsa City County libraries have those guides as well. And Josh said there are at least 50 copies, or there are about 50 copies left there's about 50 people on this call. So operators are standing by. I wanted to give our other panelists a chance to answer. Are there resources you trust or you use in evaluating issues and/or candidates, Dr. Meyers Morgan? And I know you didn't necessarily prepare for this question. Feel free to punt.
No, I think if I say it'll no. I do really like NPR in all the formats. I really do appreciate the podcasts, the radio station, and going to their website. So that is where in the morning, that's where I start. My husband starts with the New York Times, and we sort of kind of cross back and forth. Where I won't start anymore is Facebook or any kind of place where I know the algorithms are getting me, because then I'm only seeing a particular type of news, and that can really sway you for the day. So that's actually where I start, and I think that's a great resource to start as well.
Dr. Lloyd-Jones, do you have resources you trust or recommend to your students or colleagues?
Sure. Similar to Meg, I enjoy a NPR affiliate podcast called Code Switch. It is one that you will be challenged, and you are certainly challenged to rethink and revisit your ideas. Another podcast that I like, two young women who host it, called Pantsuit Podcast. Pantsuit Podcast. They are dynamic. Both are attorneys, and they unpack issues in ways that are understandable, but complicated as well. And then I like a couple of books. One that I am suggesting for families. It's called "I Think You're Wrong, But I'm Listening." And it's by Sarah Stewart Holland and Associates. And that's one, we all have diverse perspectives, but we should be able to coexist. And this book gives us strategies on how to do that. And then the final resource is another book, What You Should Know About Politics But Don't. And that's by Jasmine Conrad. Both of those books and two podcasts I highly recommend.
Thank you. Those both sound like interesting resources. I've definitely heard of Code Switch and listened to several episodes. It really is something that's incredible, very dynamic. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about language, because in many ways, well, language is how we communicate, but I think our discourse, if you will, has coarsened. It has become, we have seen somewhat of a more vulgarity, less patience, less flowery language, shall we say, in our politics as of late, I would say over maybe the last decade. I want to address this question to, well, I'll start with Dr. Lloyd-Jones, Dr. Meyers Morgan. What are some phrases we can use, some language you can specifically use to de-escalate a tense conversation? And this may occur again, that you may have experience with this in your classroom, or how can we use words to take a disagreement and try to bring it back to center where we can have constructive dialogue? And I guess, Dr. Meyers Morgan, let's go with you.
Yeah, I will say and this is a little bit going to the question in the chat as well, is just, I feel like in teaching for this long over the course of a few presidents, it seems like the humor has gone, and humor is such a great, equalizer, and it helps us listen a little bit better. So in the classroom, that's certainly like a tool that I use to make sure that, everyone's being cool. And we have the wide spectrum in our classroom, both in age and political affiliation. And I think there's just a mutual respect and a sense of humor that is the way that we get through it. What I'll say, the two things that escalate any conversation, I would say in the classroom, and then I'll give an example here in my neighborhood. The first is that we're trying to change someone's opinion. That's when escalation starts, and we just start hammering because we're going to get you to think what I think. And the second is that we start performing. And when I really first noticed this was when Senator McCain died. And most of the posts I saw about Senator McCain's death was, you know, though I didn't agree with his politics, I'm really sad to see him. And it was just this weird way that we really want people to know where we stand all the time. And we're really like overt about it. And half of the time we're saying things just so people know what we believe. And on our street, we live in a neighborhood where there are no political signs except for on our street. And this has escalated. And my neighbor put his sign out, and I have a different candidate I'd like to win, so I put my sign out. And now the entire street is just one escalation of everybody's signs. And so everyone that comes to our house says, man, this is the most political street I've ever seen. It's like, yes, we are absolutely escalating this because one, we're trying to get someone to agree with us, or two, we're wanting to make sure people know where we stand all the time, even when we're talking about someone a head of state passing. So one phrase that I'd say that is really helpful when you're talking one-on-one with someone is to say, tell me what is at stake for you in this. Because it might not be, I think this candidate is brilliant, or I think this candidate is perfect. It might be, you know, my kid's education is at stake here, or my sense of normalcy, or my sense of duty, or my sense of whatever it might be. And I think being able to kind of name what's at stake can sometimes de-escalate and take it out of the political spectrum and put it kind of into, this is where I'm coming from, this is what feels at stake. And I think that can get you back to a little bit more constructive place.
I'm just curious, did you put up a sign in response to the neighbor who put up a sort of a differing sign, and it escalated?
Yes,
from
and
there?
I've never put up a yard sign in my entire life. And I'm not really a big, they're fine, whatever. But again, I feel like it's an escalation. And now if you would like to come down our street and see all the different signs, and then in response to my sign, my neighbor put out 2 signs and then a flag. And then our other neighbor put out a sign. So, I mean, we're going to wrap our house before too long. And like our political candidate, if we don't just calm down. And we're all great neighbors, right? We're all like friends, and we all can agree on a lot of things. But right now we're just in a point of escalation. It
I'm
feels
almost
very
picturing like a political cartoon, you know, like on the op-ed page. And
Yes.
you just but have you, or will you, or when will you engage in a dialogue, or do you see like that ship has sailed?
I have actually fantasized or been very worried that our neighbors are going to like knock on our door and start, like, I've in my mind built up what I'm going to say in response if they come over, because this is the first time any of us have really been overtly political on the street. And so I'm getting heart palpitations right now thinking about, you know, him knocking on the door, because these are people, like, we pick up each other's packages when they go out of town, and they do the same for us. And now it feels like, uh-oh, did we just put a literal stake in the ground that has changed the course of our relationship? I can't imagine we still wave. Everyone's still waving, so we feel like, okay. I will keep
important.
the 53 people on the call updated as the events progress on how this is going, but it's tense.
In the future visioning of the dialogue, are you cutting their hair? No, I'll leave. I'm just a joke. Okay, Dr.
Depends on how the
Lloyd-Jones.
election turns out.
So Dr. Lloyd-Jones, some phrases that you have used or developed or found that are helpful when there are points of dissension or heated tempers.
I have a few because I think we can strategically use words to repair, rescue, and even restore relationships. And so in counseling, one that's often used, and I take it outside of counseling, I use it in my classroom. I also use it with family and friends, and in committee meetings. And it is, what I heard you say is. And then you move and add that. So what I heard you say is a phrase that speaks immediately to the speaker and informs the speaker that you were and are listening, and you care about what the speaker has to say. And so what I heard you say, I might be, for example, when I'm talking to a group and I can hear someone say, oh, you just don't understand. That's not what I mean. You're taking it wrong. I can say, what I heard you say is that you want A, You need B to get A, and C will make you happy. And if I am correct, the speaker will say, yes, you are correct. However, if I am incorrect, the speaker has an opportunity to clarify and to correct. And then I can restate it. So that's a very good phrase, what I heard you say. Another one is similar to Meg's. What's your biggest concern? Just recently, I was speaking to a small group of young people, and they shared with me that they were not planning to vote. And I asked,
Wow.
why not? I did ask why not, Meg. Sorry. I wanted to
I would
know.
have too, Brenda. I would have too.
This is all about civil discourse. I think it's perfectly appropriate to ask people why they would not exercise their right to vote. I mean,
Shake them
come
as you
on.
ask it. Yeah.
And they began to state that they did not care for either of the candidates or either of the parties, and voting for a lesser. This is key. Listen to this. I love their thinking, but not their actions. This is what they said: voting for a lesser evil is still voting for evil. And I had never heard that statement before. And so I listened, and then I asked them, what's your biggest concern? What are you really concerned about? And I learned that they did not think their vote would count or be counted. That was their biggest concern. They had heard of voter suppression, the mail issue, and why vote? Why even try if it's not going to count? So I think asking what's your biggest concern, what's your biggest fear, gets at that underlining issue, and it offered me a chance to talk to them about why they can increase their trust, because really it was an issue of trust. And I was able to speak with them and hopefully convince them to vote on the 3rd of November. And my last one, how about we take a breather? And it's perfectly fine to step away and say, let's take a break. We can come back and talk later. Also, you can identify a time when it might be better, tomorrow, later in the evening. But it's always all right to step away and take a break.
Thank you.
May I interject something?
Please, yes.
About voting? Because I think we generally approach voting with the idea, is my vote going to make a difference? And I suggest there's another dynamic here. You know, when we go vote, we're electing policymakers for our government. So to those policymakers, the universe to which they answer and represent is the universe of people who vote. And so if we go vote, if we go to the polling place and cast a ballot, even if it is a blank ballot, we are influencing the universe to which policymakers have to respond. Because policymakers know, for example, young people don't turn out much, so we don't have to pay much attention to their opinion. Older voters, they're real regular. So we've got to be attentive to the needs of older people. The policymakers know who are the participants. They know that often on an individual basis, but more importantly, they know it in a statistical basis. And so for folks to not go vote is to eliminate themselves and other people like them from participation in that world to which policymakers respond when they make policy.
Thank you.
You're here.
Professor Randle, I have one more for you, and this is highlighting the fact, as the senior member of our panel, I wanted to ask you how this election cycle compares to previous election cycles, you know, ones you've participated in as a voter, as a candidate. What's different now versus then, and how, you know, in your perceptions?
Well, my perception is we've never had one like this. not in modern times. The intensity of the feeling, the evaluation of what's at stake. I mean, we're talking about really, really basic and important things here. Those on the side I support feel that way. Those on the side that I don't support feel equally strong that we are in a battle for the soul of the country, and in a way we're going to decide that on election day. And I think both of us can make pretty darn good arguments for why this is an election about the soul of the country. So, we've had other elections, and we think, well, if our side loses, that'll be unfortunate, but we can make it to the next election. And this time, the stakes just seem so huge. The emotions are so great, and that's why it is really of historic proportions what we're doing this year. And we're going to see that. We're already seeing that in the just extraordinary turnout and participation in early voting, balloting, that kind of thing. This will be, the experts say, the highest level of participation since 1908, when it was William Howard Taft versus William Jennings Bryan. So we haven't been as worked up as a country in over 100 years.
Okay, thank you. Well, we have some excellent questions that have come in from our audience and our listeners. And I want to start with one that was submitted a little bit beforehand. And this is kind of an interesting one for the workplace. So, and this is really to any of you, but how does one communicate if their own director or manager is expressing their own, meaning the manager or director's personal or political views, but it's causing unrest amongst either the employee asking the question or other employees in the area? How do you communicate that it's making you uncomfortable without fear of retaliation? And so I would ask any of you that are willing to chime in. And Dr. Lloyd-Jones, I know you run a nonprofit. I wonder if that, in terms of having employees or staff or board members with whom you might disagree, how do you engage in civil discourse with folks where that might come up, or amongst employees?
A great question. I came upon an interesting research finding. 1 in 10 American workers have experienced tension or stress from recent political discussions in the workplace. And this is according to a survey conducted by the American Psychological Association. And so, in my own nonprofit, we have a code of conduct policy, and we are to govern ourselves accordingly. And it is important too, during this season, that I have sent out an email reminding everyone to make sure to honor the code of conduct policy, and that we can talk about political issues. However, the conversation goes wrong when we begin to make discriminatory remarks or acts and consequently offend another member of the organization or committee. And I have also talk to individuals one-on-one to share that this comment was received offensively, and right away the person said that was not my intention. I will contact the individual, and they got on the same page, and now they're working on a task force together. And so I think if we are open to being civil and open to taking the advice or taking someone's concern seriously as opposed to being dismissive. I didn't mean it. That's the other person's concern. It shouldn't impact me. But we need to be open. We need to have compassion, empathy. These are all the qualities that are necessary, particularly for a time as this.
Thank you.
And I'd also say, because as a person that leads a classroom that has been called out, not necessarily for this, but I mean anything, like we think your deadlines are insane or whatever the case may be. I often don't know. And so I try to build a culture around myself of give me feedback, not knowing if this manager is that. One thing I would caution you is to just not make it, you're not there to fight everyone's battle. So I wouldn't go storm the castle on behalf of the entire department, but I would absolutely say, you know, what I'm feeling is this. And I'm wondering if you and I can have a conversation about how to correct that together and make it sort of collaborative. But if people come to me, if a student comes to me and says, everybody hates the deadline, you know, one, I might feel attacked, or two, I might blow it off. But if somebody comes to me and raises a point, kind of like Brenda was saying, then I might reflect and realize, oh, I maybe made an error, or I said something wrong in class, or I didn't make something clear. But yeah, there are policies. I always say to go back to that. And then I also say to document, like you want to document these types of things just to be clear for yourself and just in the future. What was said, when was it said? And again, only the things that happen specifically to you and not the opinions of everybody else. But that is an unfortunate reality for where we are right now in the workplace.
Thank you. We have an audience question here that I'd like to posit, and it's the commenters stating that discourse has gotten angry and nasty. There have always been strong opinions and disagreement, but things feel different now. And she goes on to say, it can't all be because of Trump and the internet. So what else has happened to cause this shift? And Professor Meyers Morgan, you alluded to the loss of humor, but is it beyond that? And why, I guess, have we lost humor?
I almost wonder, I mean, I hate to go back on what the commenter said about the internet, but I think it is a great equalizer. And now everybody has a megaphone and everyone has a platform and it's relentless. And I think that the birth of the 24-hour news cycle was the death of sort of political discourse, because now we have to fill the time 24 hours a day, and we have to fill newspapers and internet, and it's sort of this endless scope without much of a filter. And you can just get away with a lot, right? The things that we would say on the internet may not be something that we'd say to someone in person. And I know we've all sent emails that people took as curt, and we were not meaning that, right? So, I mean, like, how can you really express nuance in an internet space when you're not really having that dialogue? I do think there is something to the change that this president has made in the way that we talk and what we think is acceptable, regardless of what side you're on. I think that that's something you could look at and say that has shifted. But yeah, I think it's just that it's constant and everyone has a microphone. It would be my guess.
And let me introduce an opinion, if I may. A large part of it is because now we inhabit a separate world. You know, back in the days of the three big networks, and we got all our news from ABC, CBS, NBC, we got the news really pretty much down the middle, or at least it was intended to be delivered to us in that way. But now we go to the cable news show. If we watch news, we go to the cable news show that reflects our opinion, and we go to the internet and we find sources that are consistent with our opinion. And so all of us nowadays inhabit a world that's just totally made up of people who think the same way as we do. And therefore it's very hard to understand who these aliens are with their strange viewpoints. There must be something wrong with them. And that's one of the worst things that has happened in the last number of decades, that we've moved away from a sort of accepting that other people are going to have different opinions, to believing that those with other opinions are bad and dangerous people. We've moved from having different opinions to having judgmental evaluations of the people who have those other opinions. That's a super, super unhealthy thing and dangerous to the democracy.
If I may add, as Rodger mentioned, cable television, and I'd like to give some credit to reality TV. Um, in terms of them being very inappropriate in terms of what is considered best practices in behavior. They, the more sarcastic they are, the more drinks they throw in one another's faces, the higher ratings they get. Oh, I think I got an amen from uh, in the background.
And Quincy?
Okay, yes. And I think people are modeling that negative behavior and thinking that it can bring them the kind of notoriety. They want to be famous, considered popular, and the more negative they can act in terms of what is considered appropriate and civil behavior, the more attention they seem to get. Even with the candidates in their debate, how do you make points? By scoring and saying something negative that people deem that is an act of leadership, and that's how someone can gain this notion of ratings. And so I think modeling this type of behavior has become commonplace. And so throwing shade, as they say, and being able to put someone down cleverly and strategically is certainly popular in this era.
Both, I mean, all good answers, but role modeling certainly has changed, as has, our ability to, get into our own echo chambers where we're hearing the same things spun around and really unaware of kind of what the other side, in quotes, is thinking about. We're at the end of the hour, so I wanted to combine a couple just to wrap up and ask each of our panelists, as briefly as you can, to talk a little bit about, one questioner referenced it as impending doom, because I think regardless of which side you're on, there is a sense that a lot is at stake and there's some anxiety associated with this election. So in general, and it may be too much to conflate it on, but I wanted to ask what you do for post-election stress relief, and or if you want to include pandemic in that, although those might be completely separate, because it's been 100 years since we've had a pandemic election. So anyone want to volunteer to go first to offer their stress reduction methods, or how you're coping with this season, and what you anticipate you'll do after the election?
I would just say to watch your informational diet. I was really guilty at the beginning of the pandemic of reading every article all day long, and it really sunk me into fear. And then if I took a week off and came back, it was kind of the same news. So I thought, okay, I probably don't have to be clicking refresh all the time. And then now I've noticed I'm doing the same thing about the election. I'm reading the polls every night. I'm doing interactive maps. And I can tell a sense in my mental health is that's not good. And so I just have to give myself, I'm going to do this 1 hour a day in the morning, and then I'm going to let it go, and I'm going to go live my life. And I'm going to do what I can to better the world where I can and have good dialogues where I can. But I'm not going to miss anything. There's no real emergency I'm going to miss. I'm with the people that I love. And I think that will be true after the election. We're almost there, Tuesday. And I saw in the chat, it might be a couple weeks after. I don't know. There's a lot of varying opinions on when we'll know the end results, but it will be one more thing that we get through. So just be careful how much you're consuming a day.
Thank you.
Go ahead. Yeah. I'm just going to give my response to that.
Please.
I think adjusting to and relaxing after the results is not going to be so difficult. Once we get past the mobs in front of the election board and the barricades on the street and the violence of the roving bands, then if all that doesn't come to pass, that we have been alerted could be the point to which we degenerate. If all that doesn't come to pass and we get a good, clear victory one way or another on election night, then I think the process will in many ways start taking care of itself. But the fact is, as you pointed out, Mr. President, we are in difficult and dangerous times of division in this country. And I think we should all really hope, which side wins, let's hope that they win by a lot, so that we don't have the kinds of fears and all of that could make these horror stories turn into reality.
Yep, well said.
Dr. Lloyd-Jones, final word to you on how you're coping with election stress or pandemic stress, or what you envision for afterward.
Oh, I can envision a bubble bath with tranquil music.
Are you gonna say tranquilizers?
No, with calming music.
Good choice.
And relaxation. I think our shoulders will be relieved, and even if we can't go out because of COVID and get massages, we can massage and use our own apparatuses and do it in a way that we haven't since this. Since the presidential race. So I'm looking forward to relaxation and some spa energy going forward.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank our panelists for participating today. We had Professors Brenda Lloyd-Jones, Rodger Randle, and Meg Meyers Morgan, who were all very wonderful and articulate in terms of their knowledge of political discourse. And would that we could all engage in civil political discourse the way you have shown us. And last word, if you haven't seen it, President Harris wrote a very thoughtful letter today that went out to the whole university, sort of both sides, Norman, HSC, et cetera, talking about how regardless of the election outcome or what side you may be on, that we're all Sooners and that we're all aspiring here at the university to further our knowledge and work for the betterment of society, and that we do all belong regardless of what side we're on. And so we often, I think, in the heat of the political moment and the coarsened discourse, lose sight of that fact. So if nothing else, I hope that this panel today encourages a continuation and prolongation of civil discourse. So thank you all very much for joining us, and go out and vote.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thanks,
Thank
President
you,
Schuman.
President Schuman.